Have you ever thought, wow, this was written by a teenager while reading Frankenstein? Even 200 years later, it's unimaginable that a 19-year-old Mary Godwin wrote a novel with an impact this long-lasting and powerful. Because she didn't. Not in the form most of us are familiar with, anyway. This isn't one of those Percy wrote Frankenstein cold takes, God forbid. Much like the creature's body, Frankenstein as a text has been subjected to and reconstruction, transformation, reanimation, time and time again. This is a story about how Mary Shelley, much like Victor Frankenstein, continuously reshaped her monster, about the events and forces that influence her and are reflected in the collection of texts we refer to as Frankenstein, and about some of my favorite movie adaptations of the classic. Let's examine the history of the novel and try to see for ourselves why this particular story not only inspired hundreds of retellings, but continues to haunt us and our media 2 centuries down the line. I'm not sure if my makeup is giving creature or if it's giving haunted ventriloquist doll.
In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
I want to start by discussing a topic that is often brought up in adaptation studies: our obsession with the adaptation's fidelity. We cannot stop asking ourselves, how true to the text is it? Spoiler, it is never true enough. It will never be true enough. Those are different media, and if you want the book, just read the book. And, I myself am guilty of playing the old compare and contrast violin. Let thee who never said the book was better cast the first stone, I guess.
Fascinating.
It's better than the Hollywood version.
Certainly dirtier.
The problem, however, lies not in the comparison of the texts itself, but in the evaluation of adaptation's quality or worthiness based on how faithfully, letter to the letter, down to a T, it follows the original. And when it comes to Frankenstein, I just want to ask, what exactly constitutes the original? In the preface to the 1831 edition, Mary Shelley wrote,
"I will add but one word as to the alterations I've made. They are principally those of style. I have changed no portion of the story, nor introduced any new ideas or circumstances."
That, simply put, is a fucking lie. And I should clarify that I am 100% pro-women lying. I personally think she should have lied more in that preface. Or at least called Lord Byron a... The late Charles Robinson, who dedicated a sizable portion of his life and career to researching all things Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, identifies 11 different versions of the text in his contribution to the Cambridge Companion to Frankenstein. For the sake of brevity and my own sanity, I am only going to focus on 4 of them.
That's really weird, Lisa.
It's the night between June 16th and June 17th, 1816. An 18-year-old Mary Godwin suddenly jolts awake. In the dream that scared her awake, she saw one of the most striking scenes of what would later become Frankenstein.
I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains, and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes.
And even though it is speculated whether Mary's dream was as vivid as she described, the 18-year-old's life didn't really call for any myth-making. She's been through a lot by that point. The daughter of a raging atheist, proto-anarchist, and scandalous political writer, William Godwin, and a feminist philosopher whose personal life was made scandalous by Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Godwin was born into quite a radical secular household. She was, as Fiona Sampson puts it in Search of Mary Shelley, a child raised by the intellectual zeitgeist. Mary received an unorthodox education that not only primed her to become a writer, but also to examine the world around her from a critical standpoint, sitting in on her father's philosophical and literary get-togethers since she was a younging, reading cutting-edge political writings and studying her mother's work. At just 16, Merely 2 years before the nightmare that started it all, Mary confesses her love to 21-year-old Percy Bysshe Shelley at her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard. R.I.P. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. You would have loved goth clubs. Just a month and some change later, the lovers run away to France and also take Mary's stepsister Jane, later known as Claire Clairmont. To Percy, who has already pulled off this running away with a 16-year-old shtick once before, and whose name is already known in radical circles, the damages in reputation are negligible. To Mary, who in short succession gives birth to 2 children fathered by an already married Percy, one of which survives only a fortnight, the doors back to ordinary society are slammed shut. Her father stops talking to her after the elopement and even passes her by in the street without acknowledging her. So in 1816, when, in big thanks to Claire's obsession with Byron and some very impressive elaborate scheming, Mary ends up spending time at Villa Diodati, she is keenly aware of the way social ostracization feels, and whom it hits the hardest. She's also keenly aware of the prejudices that permeate even the most progressive literary circles. 1816 is known as the year without a summer. Basically, a bunch of shit happened the previous year, a powerful volcano explosion in current-day Indonesia among them, so the summer temperatures dipped to a historical minimum. Villa Diodati then becomes the go-to hanging out, drinking and taking drugs spot for a motley crew of literature's messiest creatures. Byron, Polidori, Claire Clairmont, Shelley,
Long-haired streak of British piss.
and Godwin. At some point, most likely bored out of their minds and a little high, like the best nights, they turn to ghost stories. And Byron proposes they each write one. Him and Shelley get started right away, but soon abandon their efforts once the weather gets better. Godwin and Polidori, on the other hand, feel left behind. Polidori comes up with a story deemed unworthy and has to restart, and Mary experiences something akin to writer's block that manifests under pressure.
I thought and pondered, vainly. I felt that blank incapability of invention, which is the greatest misery of authorship, when dull nothing replies to our anxious invocations. Have you thought of a story? I was asked each morning, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative.
So when the vivid image of an artist terrified of his very own creation visits her, Mary welcomes it with open arms. Between June 17th and sometime in August, she writes the short story that will go on to become Frankenstein. This text does not survive, but from the documents that do, we can assume that it lacked the Walton framing. That's the captain who writes Victor's story down in letters to his sister Margaret Saville, and that similarly, Safie's story gets added later. This version is much shorter than the one we're familiar with, but the story is starting to take its monstrous shape. Even at that point, Mary Godwin's story is very particular about whose voice is listened to and about who becomes the outsider. It makes all the more sense that outsiders of all stripes are often drawn to horror and identify with the creature in particular. The 2024 Lisa Frankenstein, despite being more of a play on pop culture's many Frankensteinian narratives than an adaptation of Mary's story, deals with the topic of outsiderdom quite explicitly. It's a coming-of-age story in which the protagonist Lisa Swallows gets an undead 200-year-old boyfriend delivered straight to her door, courtesy of a well-timed lightning strike that reanimates said 200-year-old boyfriend back to life. Hijinks ensue, there's blood, guts, revenge, and a chopped-off penis. It should be said that the creature, however unintentionally, is trans or butch-coded. From him spending most of the movie in a closet, to the DIY bottom surgery situation, to the rainbow suspenders, to him keeping the earring in his new ear, to taking revenge on a random homophobic grandpa.
Pull harder. What are you, a little fruitcake, huh?
To this moment that reads especially interestingly through a trans lens.
Oh. Oh, I can't do anything about that. But it's okay. They're just things that make you different. There's this really attractive guy on Days of Our Lives who has to wear an eye patch. He's a very popular character and his patch doesn't define him. What's his name? Patch. His name is Patch.
Yet, in this section, I want to focus on outsiderdom in a broader sense, and some of the ways Lisa Frankenstein plays around with the same societal dynamics that Mary Shelley's story does. We'll get to the gay stuff later, I promise. We always do. In a reversal of the dynamic that Mary Shelley, then still Godwin, saw in that nightmare in 1816, Lisa is not the one who brings creature to life, not the way Victor Frankenstein does, at least. Instead, the forces of nature, lighting in this case, bestow the creature upon her after she experiences a particular low, being assaulted at a party when she attempts to go out and socialize for the first time after losing her mom and moving to a completely new place and trying to adapt to this newfound family. And unlike Victor, who would hope that left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, Lisa becomes the Frankenstein that stepped up, fixing up the creature's missing parts, and teaching him about the century that's foreign to him. While Victor's outsiderdom is self-imposed, Lisa's is decided for her by others. Both of them deal with loss, but it is Lisa's grief that is seen as some kind of flaw.
After my mom died, everyone was in such a hurry to go back to normal. And they kept acting like I had a problem because I couldn't stop missing her.
Additionally, the theme of social norms originally explored by Mary Shelley comes through very clearly in this movie, and it's most obvious when we look at the family dynamics. For example, Taffy, Lisa's stepsister, at first seems to be the example of the very typical cheerleader type. She's pretty, she's popular, she's
The type of person who usually bullies me or looks right through me.
In reality, Taffy is very sweet and the only actually alive person who sees Lisa and listens to her. She also does her best throughout the movie to teach Lisa the ways of the proper and polite hierarchical society. Fully well-intentioned, but misguided nonetheless. Another character that attempts to make the main character normal, albeit in a way that is much more forceful and malicious than Taffy's, is Lisa's stepmother Janet. And it is Janet who articulates the norms and expectations at play.
But you're either crazy or you're just goddamned inconsiderate.
The two are most notably equated, which highlights the way the movie satirizes societal expectations and rules. Ultimately, Janet, the emblem of keeping up appearances and propriety, meets her demise at the hands of the creature who springs from the closet. Talk about commentary on social norms. Finally, continuing Mary Godwin's analysis of who is allowed to speak and who is listened to, the creature is not able to utter a single word until the very end of the movie.
After my mom died, I got diagnosed with traumatic mutism. That's where you don't talk at all. Are you going to talk? Copy that.
And it's notable that Lisa, the only other obvious outsider, is the sole person who understands his grunts and is not just willing, but able to communicate with him. It is, of course, a reversal of the original story, where both the creature and female characters are the ones who exist solely through Victor's view and his perception and description of them, and are therefore essentially rendered speechless. Lisa Frankenstein is an adaptation in a very loose sense of the word. Like the creature, it's a sum of reworked and re-examined parts and the works that came before.
There's a kind of a connective tissue between all the female protagonists that I've written.
It does not aim at retelling the story, but rather plays around with a lot of the themes and problems raised by Mary Godwin's brainchild. In a world where most adaptations are evaluated on the basis of their fidelity, perhaps we could benefit from expanding our definition of adaptation and turning our attention to works like Lisa Frankenstein to satiate the need for Frankensteinian narratives. The movie examines a number of topics explored in the original story, but as of 1816, one of the most notorious literary myths had not yet taken on its proper monstrous form that we are familiar with. There's a movie that I also couldn't, not mention when it comes to outsiderdom and the weird girls of Frankenstein, 2002's May. The title character is not only the Frankenstein, but also the creature of the story. The movie follows May, a vet assistant and certified outcast, and her journey towards becoming, in a way, Victor Frankenstein. In this iteration of the myth, it is societal isolation and the reject status that leave May yearning for a companion, much like the creature. Yet her actions at the end of the film signal a transformation into the mad scientist. Creation, then, does not turn hubris into tragedy for May like it did for Victor, but rather becomes a solution to said tragedy. The movie, additionally, brings to the surface the theme of disability and social ostracization faced by disabled people. And I'm not just talking about the main character's eye issues. While that does act as a signifier of May's otherness, she is coded as neurodivergent and struggling with social interaction, interpretation of other people's actions or words, and social norms. I do wish that the way physical disability affects May was explored a bit more, but what is examined in the movie makes for an interesting and critical play on the familiar story archetype, so I just had to talk about it, even if briefly. So with that out of the way, let's continue down the stream of Frankenstein's history and take a look at cinema's most fabulous, glittery, and rock and rolling Frankenstein.
I see you shiver with anticipation.
It's August 21st, 1816, and Mary notes in her diary that she and Shelley talked about the story, and as Robinson speculates, decided to expand the Ur text into a full-fledged novel. From August 1816 to April 1817, Mary, by then already Shelley, works on the book. Percy edits the draft, and the Shelleys calculate how they might restructure the draft of a 2-volume novel in 33 chapters into what became a fair copy of a 3-volume novel in 23 chapters. Between May 1817, when the fair copy is finished, and August of the same year, when Lackington and company express interest in Frankenstein, Mary has to face a number of rejections. On the 6th of August 1817, after the novel has been rejected by John Murray, Byron's publisher, and Ollier, as well as possibly more publishers that have been reached out to by William Godwin, Percy adds the following postscriptum to Mary's letter to Marion Hunt. Poor Mary's book came back with a refusal, which has put me rather in ill spirits. Does any kind friend of yours, Marianne, know any bookseller or has any influence with one? On January 1st, 1818, after a number of revisions, some of them handled by Percy due to Mary taking care of their recently born daughter Clara, the novel is finally published. It is authorless, with only a dedication to William Godwin and a preface by Percy Shelley. The reasons for this decision are not documented, but we can speculate that it was due to 2 reasons. The identity of the author, being not only a woman, but also the low-key disgraced daughter of Godwin and Wollstonecraft, and the content of the novel too. Gory and scary and, quite provocative. And while many initially mistakenly attribute the novel to Percy Shelley, Frankenstein is, in a lot of ways, a pastiche of Mary's life and a pastiche of pop culture at the time. Galvanism, despite not being explicitly referred to in the 1818 text, might have been the thing that inspired Mary's nightmare, as per the 1831 preface.
During one of the conversations between Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth.
The experiments of Luigi Galvani, conducted merely 2 or 3 decades earlier, have brought a lot of anxieties about life and death into the mainstream. More to that, the very era of Mary writing Frankenstein was characterized by a perceived struggle between scientific progress and God, or the quote-unquote natural way of life. If you can reanimate dead flesh, what would that mean for the very understanding of life and its temporariness? Were people finally at the point where they could bestow life upon flesh, where they could defeat death as a concept? No, they weren't. They weren't even at that scary guy who gets his son's blood pumped into his veins to stay young phase. But, it very much felt like it. In addition to the wider cultural fear surrounding life and death, at the time that Frankenstein was published in 1818, 20-year-old Mary had already given birth to 3 children, only one of which would survive infancy. And yes, the child mortality rate in the 19th century was way higher than it is now, but that doesn't mean that losing a child was any easier or any less traumatizing. Adding to the body horror aspect of a creature reconstituted and resurrected, and the creator giving said creature life, as well as childbirth and loss in the 19th century, Mary had possibly drawn on her experience with various illnesses in adolescence. Most notably, from 1811 to 1814, Mary is sent away to Ramsgate and Dundee a number of times, and as Fiona Sampson describes it, at the time of her absences, Mary's own hand, in fact, one entire arm, is often hidden in dressings. It has become mysteriously handicapped. Since the childhood letters from Mary to her father have been destroyed, and our understanding of illnesses in general has evolved since then, Sampson's speculations in regards to the specifics of Mary's diagnosis range from eczema to psoriasis to tuberculosis. But as I would argue, pinpointing Mary's condition is irrelevant in the context of this video. The general understanding of how the illness manifests suffices. It impacts her hand and arm most severely, and she is often unable to move it, at times even using a sling. The inflammations also leave her spent with pain. Rigid and huge with bandages, her limb must feel like a monstrous appendage stitched from some other body onto her own, as the creature she invents in her first novel, which will be stitched together by Frankenstein. Through combining and synthesizing the wider societal anxieties and her own experiences, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein becomes one of the first and one of the most influential works of body horror, even though the term would not be coined for at least a century and a half after Victor's and Creature's tales are first printed and read. Finally, the addition of the found manuscript framed to the story is of particular note to us when examining Frankenstein as a, for lack of a better term, Frankensteinian text. The ur-text lacked this narrative structure, which was added somewhere between Mary and Percy discussing reworking the short story into a novel and the first draft being created by Mary. The very nature of a found manuscript is body horror adjacent in itself, and reminiscent of the creature. The way Creature's body is comprised of a variety of flesh bits which all come from different sources, the body of the novel is comprised of letters from Captain Walton to his sister, including Victor's retellings of his and the Creature's stories, Victor's corrections, and Walton's viewpoint on top of that all. The letters, and in particular their inclusion of poems written after Victor's death, which happens in 1799 according to most analysis of the narrative, indicate that the text of the novel is a result of Margaret Saville, Walton's sister, putting them together to create a narrative and editing them. An adaptation that encompasses both the body horror and the pastiche aspect of the novel is often not considered an adaptation at all, or at least not in earnest. I am, of course, talking about the 1975 The Rocky Horror Picture Show. In Vulnerable Monsters, a comparison of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Richard O'Brien's Rocky Horror, Olivia Moscott makes a case for Rocky Horror Picture Show as a legitimate adaptation of Frankenstein, despite a number of deviations. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, holding the record for the longest theatrical run of all time, is a movie that follows all-American Brad and Janet, who get stranded in the rain and end up joining a rather extravagant party hosted by the one and only Frankenfurter, a fishnet and corset-clad mad scientist from transsexual Transylvania, and their insane posse of extraterrestrials and freaks of all kinds. Frank reveals that they have created a man with blonde hair and a tan who's good for relieving their tension. In a very obvious play on the Frankenstein story, hijinks ensue. Moscott argues that O'Brien's text deals with a lot of the same anxieties as Mary Shelley's. In 1970s America, technological and scientific advancement were progressing at an alarming rate, raising the same questions in the minds of good conservative Americans as Frankenstein raised within its own primary audience. Is this progression unnatural? How far is too far? And will God be lost as traditional ways of life are abandoned? The comparison additionally draws a parallel between Brad and Janet and Captain Walton, who, like the mad scientist, may have been tempted to walk a similar path of extremism, but ultimately decide against it after witnessing the story of Frankenfurter / Frankenstein's downfall and taken it as a warning. Don't dream it, be it even bears a striking resemblance to Victor Frankenstein's impassioned speech he delivers to Walton's crew, urging them to continue down the destructive path. But perhaps even more obviously, Rocky Horror amplifies the original text's gender-bandy aspects and gender transgressions of its characters. Much like Victor Frankenstein is queered through taking on an explicitly maternal role of giving birth, Frankenfurter's gender and sexual ambiguity serves to up the ante of the narrative of going against nature or against God, which is often weaponized against queer people. Now, here's where I should probably take a brief detour to touch on Mary Shelley's own sexuality. Of course, it's time for the gay stuff. In a letter to close friend Edward Trelawney, 12 years after losing Percy, Mary wrote,
I was so ready to give myself away, and being afraid of men, I was apt to get tousy-mousy for women.
Fiona Sampson examines this against the backdrop of Mary's history of close female friendships that might otherwise not have been seen as anything but that, and suggests that Mary's sexuality might have been unclear to herself. After all, the 19th century wasn't exactly rich when it comes to widely accepted and specific labels, and even now we still struggle with describing experiences that are nebulous or fluid. But whether Mary Shelley recognized herself as queer of some stripe or not, we do know that she at least sympathized with those who did, and saw herself as in community with them. In 1827, Mary actually helps Isabella Robinson and Walter Sholto Douglas born under the name Mary Diana Dodds, pose as a man and wife and procure fake documents which they use to flee to France. There's been many a frankly uncomfortable debate about whether Walter was trans, butch, or just a crossdresser, but the gist of it is that this person lived and worked as a man despite being assigned female at birth, and Mary Shelley was not only aware of this fact, but actually close friends with him and his wife, and even helped them financially. So like, be gay, do crime, or whatever the fuck Mary Shelley said. So Mary Shelley's experiences with queerness and the queer community likely informed her depictions of outcasts and outsiderdom as expressed in both Victor and the Creature. It is all the more logical, then, that adaptations of Frankenstein and Frankensteinian stories have a long queer lineage. From James Whale, the director of the Universal Classics Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, and the first guy who was blackballed because he refused to stay in the closet, to the Frankensteinian motifs in films based on the misrepresented story of Killer Ed Gein, and depicting queerness in conjunction with criminal transgressions, such as Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. Mary Shelley's mad scientist and his creature find themselves deeply entrenched in queer and queered narratives. As Jack Halberstam points out in Skin Shows, the very coding of monstrous body horror narratives has changed over time. Much ground has been traveled between the stitched monstrosity of Frankenstein and the sutured gender horror of Buffalo Bill. While both monsters have been sewn into skin bodysuits and while both want to jump out of their skins, the 19th century monster is marked by racial or species violation, while Buffalo Bill seems to be all gender. Considering the queer and trans specifically spectators' affinity for body horror as a cathartic and even therapeutical experience, it is no wonder that the story of Frankenstein's creature resonates with queer people. He's just like me for real. Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix is one of the more well-known pieces examining the story of Victor Frankenstein and his creation through a transgender lens. The following quote is on the lengthier side, but it describes the connection in a very powerful way, so I want you to hear it in full. Like the monster, I could speak of my earliest memories, and how I became aware of my difference from everyone around me. I can describe how I acquired a monstrous identity by taking on the label transsexual to name parts of myself that I could not otherwise explain. I too have discovered journals of men who made my body, and who have made the bodies of creatures like me since the 1930s. I live daily with the consequences of medicine's definition of my identity as an emotional disorder. Through the filter of this official pathologization, the sounds that come out of my mouth can be summarily dismissed as the confused rantings of a diseased mind. With all of that, coming back to Frankenfurter and Rocky, we see that in following the gender-queered expression and identity, the monstrosity has been transferred to Frank, instead of being left to their creation. The Frankensteinian aspects of Frankenfurter show up in their gender and genre transgressions as well, by means of crossing over in every imaginable way. Cross-genre, cross-dressing, transsexuality, monstrosity, monster-making. Frank is not just Victor, but the creature too. Richard O'Brien, who came out as third gender later in life, highlights the link between queerness, body horror, and monstrosity in a movie that both satirizes and follows the conventions of the Hays Code. And even though textually Frankenfurter is defeated because the light that confused and repressed Brad and Janet see over the Frankenstein's place has become a very comforting notion for all sorts of creatures of the night. It is all the more notable, then, that Rocky Horror midnight screenings still serve as a light for queers and weirdos, a light that leads to a place which continues to be a refuge and sanctuary for people who need it. The Rocky Horror Picture Show does not just blindly follow the conventions left over from the Hays Code, it is an intentional pastiche of science fiction and horror B-movie tropes made during the era. From the goody two-shoes Brad and Janet, to the mad scientist, to the scary dilapidated castle, to rock and roll tunes, to certain scenes and visuals, Rocky Horror Picture Show takes pride in being stitched together from dead flesh. Like Mary Shelley's novel, and like The Creature, Rocky Horror is assembled of various pieces and brought to life, or reanimated by its creators. But the events that would soon take place in Mary Shelley's life would change not only her, but Frankenstein as a text as well.
I guess we can't punish Victor for bringing Sparky back from the dead.
It's July 19th, 1822, and an exhausted Mary Shelley is upstairs at the Casa Magni near the village of San Terenzo in the northwest of Italy, where her and Percy Shelley have been residing since April, when Edward Trelawney suddenly enters the room, completely silent, but with a loaded expression. Trelawney doesn't need to say anything, and Mary doesn't need to ask. She knows her worst fears. The fears that have been plaguing her non-stop for the last week have just become reality. Percy Shelley is dead. His, Edward Williams's, and boat boy Charles Vivian's bodies washed up near Livorno after all three men passed away in a boating accident on July 8th. On August 15th, that same year, in a long and honestly heartbreaking letter to friend Maria Gisborne, grieving Mary Shelley writes,
Well, here's my story. The last story I shall have to tell all that might have been bright in my life is now despoiled. I shall live to improve myself, to take care of my child, and render myself worthy to join him.
Loss seems to follow Mary Shelley throughout her life, even more so than would be expected in her era. Between the initial publication of Frankenstein and Percy's death, Mary loses her son. She gives birth to Percy Florence Shelley, the only child of the couple that would survive, in 1819. And in 1822, just a mere month before her husband's death, she almost dies because of a miscarriage. At that point, Frankenstein is all the rage. It has become something of a modern classic. It's already been translated to French, the first edition that actually rightfully credits Mary Shelley as the author, a rare W for the French, and various stage adaptations have been popping up all over the place. But Mary is overcome with grief. In addition, various close friendships of hers start to sour, and she is experiencing isolation that seems to be all-encompassing and crushing. She is also left to fend for herself and her child, which, if you can imagine, was not the easiest thing for a woman to do in the 19th century. After seeing Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein in 1823, Mary Shelley writes to her friend Leigh Hunt,
But lo and behold, I found myself famous. Frankenstein had prodigious success as a drama and was about to be repeated for the 23rd night at the English Opera House.
And even though the playbill amused her extremely, and she enjoyed the way Creature's actor portrayed a life freshly animated, the stage adaptations, due to the novel being published anonymously and the very questionable state of laws surrounding authorship and copyright, aren't paying Mary any sort of royalties. Mary's father, William Godwin, who is warmed up to his daughter, notices the success of Frankenstein and ensures that a second edition of the novel is published, so that Mary can capitalize to at least some degree on the popularity of her work. In February 1823, he writes to Mary that Frankenstein is universally known and everywhere respected. In July the same year, he writes to Mary again, saying he has intention to publish 500 copies of the novel. On August 11th, a so-called new edition of Frankenstein is published by G. and W. B. Whitaker, with Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley acknowledged as the author for the first time in the English-speaking world. But there's a twist. Of course there is. Godwin, being a publisher himself, also sticks his hand into the Frankenstein pot and makes over 100 changes to the text of the 1818 edition. Most of them, as Murray points out, are brief, such as word substitutions, but it's important that the novel is slightly structurally reworked. Instead of being split into 3 volumes, the 1823 edition is just 2. The 2012 Frankenweenie, a co-production between Walt Disney Pictures and Tim Burton Productions, is the better-known feature-length stop-motion remake of Burton's 1984 film, which I personally prefer and will therefore be discussing. Burton's original take on the story, being only around half an hour long, has a punchier and less self-indulgent narrative, and tells a very simple yet powerful story that deals with love and loss. Victor Frankenstein, a young boy, has what is implied to be his first encounter with death, when his beloved dog Sparky is killed by a car. The child learns about galvanism and revives Sparky in secret, but both his parents and his neighbors find out quite soon. Hijinks ensue. The story of a child lashing out at the world over losing someone close and aiming to revive that particular creature is closer to our modern depictions of the Frankenstein story than it is to the 1818 or 1823 text. Although I should note, this Victor is closer to Shelley's Victor in age than most other Victors, which aids the narrative of obsession and spiral of a young mind. At the same time, this all-encompassing grief that serves as motivation reflects Mary Shelley's life, and her resolve to live first and foremost for her son Percy Florence after losing her husband. Much like Victor in Frankenweenie, Mary cannot simply let her love go. When Percy Shelley's body is burned, Edward Trelawney snatches his heart before it's lost to flames, and although only after some very well-deserved shaming from Jane Williams.
Mama, we need to have an emergency conference because this bitch is eating your nachos. This woman is tearing into your fucking meal, and you need to do something about it quickly.
He passes the organ down to Mary. Mary Shelley, in a gesture that is not only devastating, but honestly also like metal as fuck, keeps her husband's heart, or as Fiona Sampson clarifies, some other grisly organ that passes for it, in a silk purse in her desk until her own death. Loss as motivation or as catalyst has established itself as a staple of any Frankensteinian narrative. From Frankenweenie to Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein to Stephen King's Pet Sematary, it is seen as the rite of passage to draw a direct line between losing loved ones and damning yourself by working, whether directly or indirectly, to bring them back and to conquer death. Yet Frankenweenie also deviates from the average Franken text in a significant way. At the end of the movie, Sparky drags Victor out of the mill, which was set on fire by the outraged neighbors, in an inversion of a similar scene in James Wells' 1931 classic. The dog then dies, but his kind act ultimately convinces the neighbors to use their car batteries to revive him again, and he even falls in love with this Bride of Frankenstein poodle. In that way, Frankenweenie is both more hopeful than most other Franken narratives, and also showcases a lack of understanding of the creature's tragedy. It is more hopeful because Sparky, through his self-sacrifice for Victor, proves to the neighbors that he is not a monster, and finds community with people previously convinced of his wickedness. It's comforting to think that the world is filled with such neighbors, who are not entirely repulsed by the very existence of the other, and are willing to change their ways once they see they are wrong. At the same time, Mary Shelley's creature is doomed by people's perception of him, no matter how many kind acts he offers to those around him or how pure his soul is. Barely hours old, as a clean slate, he is shunned and abandoned by his very creator, and perhaps most notably, he is rejected and immediately perceived as a threat that should be struck down even by the de Lacy family, whose shed he lives in and through observing whom he becomes not only a cognizant, but an articulate and educated being. The only person who does not respond to the creature's existence with violence is de Lacy himself, who is blind and therefore immune to societal preconceptions about the creature's appearance. Frankenweenie, obviously, is aimed at a younger audience and therefore goes for the simpler, less heartbreaking ending. But at the same time, it feels like a monster tragedy depicted by someone who doesn't know what it's like to be the monster. Mary Shelley's novel, on the other hand, resonates with those whose self-conception is defined or influenced by being the proverbial monster or other, as decided by others and not undoable through heroic acts or demonstration of goodwill. Both narratives are valuable, Frankenweenie essentially arriving at the same point where the reader or viewer re-examines their own preconceived notions, but I do prefer Shelley's version. Del Toro's new take on the story, interestingly enough, balances the two approaches. The creature is seen and embraced by Elizabeth, another outsider, and ultimately his story convinces both Walton and Frankenstein, but the resistance he is initially met with, and the treatment he receives throughout the movie, is characterized by that violent attitude Shelley's novel describes. And since we have finally arrived at the topic, let's discuss some of the big pop culture Frankensteins, the 1831 text, and the long-awaited Guillermo del Toro adaptation alike.
I am obscene to you, but to my Sith I simply am. Begone!
It's Halloween 1831, and Henry Colburn and Richard Bentley release into the bookstores 4,020 copies of Frankenstein, the biggest run the novel has had. But this isn't your dad's Frankenstein. Oh no, it's the authoritative version, with a preface by the novel's actual author, detailing the backstory of the writing competition that produced it. The same preface I've been quoting throughout the video the very same preface Mary Shelley kinda girl-bossed and gaslit in when she claimed the text had not been altered in any way. The truth is, it was. Most analyses show that Mary actually used the 1823 version with her dad's edits, not the 1818 one, as the basis for the 1831 text. Part of it is the fact that the publishers wanted to assure the readers that they were the only ones who had the true and revised version of the novel, and that copyright restrictions made printing the exact same text impossible. And part of it was that Mary herself changed. The 20-year-old author of the 1818 text was gone. In 1831, when the most commonly read version of Frankenstein was hot off the press, Mary Shelley is 34. With a teenager son, and she has been a widow for as long as she was married. The novel she first conceptualized 15 years earlier is a modern classic, well embedded into the zeitgeist, with an additional reprint in 1826 and dozens of stage adaptations. But Mary is not the same person she was a decade and a half earlier. So when she revises her own work, she cannot help but bring in some of the experiences that shaped her life into the text, just like she did all those years ago when she wrote the novel. One example of the differences between the 1818 and the 1831 texts is the intensified presence of capital D destiny, or capital F fate. In the 1818 Frankenstein, Victor is free, or at least freer, to alter the trajectory of the events. 1831 Victor, on the other hand, is doomed the second he decides to become God, and his fate follows him no matter how hard he tries to get away. Scholars suggest these edits are a result of Mary's philosophical views changing due to the overwhelming feelings of loss and isolation. Since she last touched the text in 1818, as I mentioned in the previous section, she had lost 2 children and her beloved husband. Not only that, the support network consisting largely of her late husband's friends failed her. From Jane Williams to Byron, Mary suffered betrayal after betrayal. In 1831, she is still trying to raise a son all by herself as a widowed woman in the 19th century, writing book after book, and money is getting tight. From 1822 onwards, her letters mention destiny increasingly more often, and always in a negative light.
The power of destiny I feel every day pressing more and more on me, and I yield myself a slave to it. But destiny has fated me to hopelessness and sorrow, and I have endured miseries that make the air a pall, the breeze a dirge, the earth a grave, and heaven a vault. Far beyond all that, I place my only hopes. My old destiny pursues me unrelentingly, and my spirit is never allowed to repose. Such is the sense I have of an evil destiny hanging over me that I tremble at every step I take in life.
In choosing a text of Frankenstein to teach, Anne Mellor writes, "The values implicitly espoused in the first edition of Frankenstein, that nature is a nurturing and benevolent life force that punishes only those who transgress against its sacred rights, that Victor is morally responsible for his acts, that the creature is potentially good but driven to evil by social and parental neglect, that a family like the de Lacys that loves all its children equally offers the best hope for human happiness, and that human egotism causes the greatest suffering in the world, are all rejected in the 1831 revisions." And not only does Mary Shelley document the changes in herself through the Frankenstein revisions, she is also aware of the meta-context and discourse that surround her novel. Thus, the aspects touching on inbreeding and incest are altered. Elizabeth becomes an adoptee instead of being Victor's actual cousin. The Frankenstein family overall is way less sickly. Mary, additionally, erases Elizabeth's powerful rants about the way retribution and persecution are bestowed onto those we consider criminals, and changes the creature's thought process and motivation for implicating Justine in William's murder, as well as reworks Henry's character to be more morally nebulous, instead of the 1818 beacon of moral purity and virtue. Frankenstein, a novel already pulled together from pieces of Mary's life, is now reworked and reanimated by a completely different Mary Shelley. Charles Robinson, when analyzing the history of Frankenstein as a text, compares Shelley to her protagonist Victor Frankenstein, a notion that is common in Franken scholarship. Did I write that sentence just to say Franken scholarship? Yes, I did, and what about it? Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which came out earlier this month, or last month, depending on when this comes out, is similar to the 1831 text in a number of aspects. First, of course, is the project's long history and the seemingly never-ending changes. But perhaps more importantly, the ever-evolving relationship between author and text.
I know somebody said it's a miracle that Mary Shelley wrote this when she was a teenager. That's the only time she could have written it. And that's what the brilliance of the book is, that he could have not written it at any other age.
In an interview with El Mundo America, Del Toro shared a sentiment I cannot help but associate with Shelley's 1831 revisions. If I had made it when I was under 40, it would have been about my father and me. It would have been the son, and the whole film would have been made by a son. For me, that was the challenge. My children were already born, and I still behaved like my father's son. Del Toro's assertion that Frankenstein and his adaptations are firmly rooted in the author's life experiences at a specific point in their life resonates with the analysis of the evolution of Frankenstein both as a text, a myth, and what Jack Halberstam terms the totalizing monster, one who threatens to never be vanquished, one immune to temporary restorations of order and peace. It is all the more interesting then that almost 2 centuries apart, and through working with different media, both Shelley and Del Toro came to a similar point in their relationship with destiny and fate. Yet where Shelley's perception was colored by a pessimistic view of destiny, Del Toro's is more neutral. I've been making films for 30 years, and in all this time I've learned that things happen when they have to happen. I don't believe in destiny or anything being predestined. There's wisdom in accepting the inevitable. The movie, like any adaptation, employs various Frankensteinian techniques. It edits the events and characters in significant ways, and pulls from both the 1818 and the 1831 texts. Del Toro's Elizabeth, for instance, is much closer to her strong-willed 1818 version than to the 1831 Angel in the House.
That is what happens when ideas are pursued by fools.
And you think me a fool?
Run to your brandy and cigars. The boys are waiting.
Yet Victor's relationship to capital D destiny is more evocative of the feelings of doom that Mary put in writing in 1831.
Destiny! Destiny! No escaping us from me!
Similarly to how Mary Shelley was working with the meta-context which developed around her novel in the 13 years since it was first published, Del Toro's Frankenstein is aware of the meta-context which hundreds of movie adaptations have shaped over the last century. Frankenstein as a myth belongs to the category of text that is always evaluated by what adaptation studies theories refer to as knowing audiences, viewers who are familiar with the story which is being adapted and evaluate the adaptation against the backdrop of the original. In a way, every Franken adaptation both depends on the meta-context of all Frankensteins that came before and offers meta-commentary regarding said context for future Frankensteins. So, to close this out, let's take a look at one of the meta-est Frankensteins.
That's Frankenstein.
And bring everything I've talked about kind of together to examine why this novel is uniquely suited to be, well, Frankensteined. Take a shot every time I say Frankenstein. You're gonna be dead in like 2 minutes.
What a filthy job. Could be worse. How? Could be raining.
In that same 1831 preface, and I promise this is the last one, in that same 1831 preface, Mary Shelley writes,
"And now, once again, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper."
Hideous progeny would be a beautiful name for a girl.
Gorgeous name for a girl.
Her hideous progeny has become a staple in a way we tell stories using all kinds of media. Endless movie adaptations, ballet and operas, paintings, retellings, and reinterpretations have cemented Frankenstein's place in the pantheon of iconic texts in the wider sense of the word. And once a text becomes a myth, texts about the text are in order. Mel Brooks's 1974 Young Frankenstein,
That's Frankenstein,
is a deeply Frankensteinian text. It pulls from the novel, the universal early 20th century adaptations, from the ways we retell the story time and time again, puts all these parts together and creates a creature that both satirizes and reflects the nebulous cloud of Frankenstein-related texts.
There, castle.
Why are you talking that way?
I thought you wanted to.
While Young Frankenstein is often dismissed as a mere parody, Sarah Haidt, a professor of Kenyon College, notes that the movie engages deeply with both its source text and that text's previous cinematic adaptations. In her contribution to Victorian literature and adaptation, Hyde talks about her experience teaching Dracula in the context of its numerous adaptations and makes a case for bringing in comedy and parody into such curricula. Such adaptations do not only explicate issues central to the original text, but often offer a playful yet critical reading of both the text they're adapting and the meta-context and discourse surrounding other adaptations. Young Frankenstein might be the most overtly aware of its rich historical lineage, but it has become a tradition in Franken adaptations to toy with other Franken adaptations.
And I think any director is a little bit Victor Frankenstein.
Lisa Frankenstein contains nods to the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Lisa?
Damn it! Janet!
As well as Mary and Percy's Lives and Art. Frankenweenie winks at other classic Universal monsters. Del Toro's Frankenstein's costuming, Elizabeth's wedding dress in particular, references James Whale, The Bride of Frankenstein. Hell, even the 1931 classic It's Alive!
It's alive!
Likely comes from Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, which Mary herself saw in 1823.
It lives. Presently, Frankenstein himself rushes in horror and trepidation from the room, and while still expressing his agony and terror, throws down the door of the laboratory, leaps the staircase, and presents his unearthly and monstrous person on the stage.
In writing and rewriting Frankenstein, Mary Shelley created a monster that is uniquely fit to be adapted at time of her time, and not only because of the novel's brilliance and engagement with a variety of themes relevant to any age, but because of its form and history too. You know, the very format of a found manuscript lends itself to many readings that examine its many layers of characters rendering a story and weaving a narrative. The continuous changes made to Mary Shelley's initial 1816 short story, similarly, ensure that even the original is not a single text, but rather a collection of texts, which contain various attitudes and stress different issues. When I asked my friends and people subscribed to this channel what their favorite Frankenstein was, I only received 2 or 3 repeat answers. And this comes not only from the fact that there are hundreds of Frankensteins lurking out there, but also from the way every adaptation or retelling creates a brand new monster by working with the text, meta-context, current issues, and the author's experiences. Mary Shelley's hideous progeny is a very comforting presence in pop culture, and every freaking outsider knows that there's always a light at the Frankenstein's place. Thanks for watching this. All the extra content on Patreon is free now, so hop over there to see how I made props and SFX for this video, and to flex on those who don't have a Sigma attention span. I'm not even gonna pick that fucking up. Incorporate the word gloves into your comment. It helps the video's engagement rate. And by proxy, my ability to pay rent. Make sure my landlord gets his December bonus early this year. Closing thoughts on Del Toro's Frankenstein. It kind of seems like the movie doesn't really know who its audience is, and therefore struggles with finding the appropriate level of overtness. And also, I want to see a 19-year-old Victor Frankenstein. 19 years old is the worst thing that you could ever be. Trust me, if you're 19, it gets better. And at 19, you develop a very specific brand of hubris that only exists at 19. And I really want to see that on the screen. I don't want to see any more grown-up Victor Frankensteins. Props to Oscar Isaac, he was great in that role, but I want to see a feral 19-year-old be a feral 19-year-old. Yeah, Mia got served. No notes on her.